Because understanding great literature is better than trying to read and understand yet another business book. On the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast, we commit to reading, dissecting, and analyzing the great books of the Western canon. You know, those books, from Jane Austen to Shakespeare, and everything else in between, that you might have fallen asleep trying to read in high school. We do this for our listeners, the owner, the entrepreneur, the manager, or the civic leader who doesn't have the time to read, dissect, analyze, and leverage insights from literature to execute leadership best practices in the confusing and chaotic postmodern world we all now inhabit. Welcome to the rescuing of Western civilization at the intersection of literature and leadership. Welcome to the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast. Hello, my name is Hasan Zarels, and this is the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast, episode, chronologically, number 111. But this is actually going to be part 2 from episode number 108, where we will continue with our conversation with Tom Libby around Zora Neale Hurston's Their Eyes Were Watching God. When we stopped our previous conversation in part 1, which has already been released, you should go back and listen to it. We had been talking about several different areas that were involved with the book, including the links between language, dialect, and intellectual capacity. This idea among the African-American community of talking white or acting white. And Tom had brought up the idea of identity based on a card coming from the federal government. And we both came to the conclusion that these are nonsensical ways of viewing identity, viewing group what's the word I'm looking for? Group loyalty, or measuring group loyalty, or even just strange ways of looking at class and looking at class structures. And we were moving very gradually into the back end of Their Eyes Were Watching God, and really exploring Janie's second marriage, at the back end of her second marriage, and then the beginnings of her connection to her third marriage. So Janie's second marriage, just so that you can all get caught up, was to Joe Starks. Joe Starks moved Janie in Their Eyes Were Watching God to Eatonville in Western Florida. In Eatonville, he set her up as a sort of a kept lady, operating the store in Eatonville, while Joe went out and moved and shook as an entrepreneur, and eventually put the first light in the town, set the first road, and became its first mayor, which is a role, and I've said this before on the podcast, that I often aspire to. I aspire to no higher than mayor of a town. I don't want to be mayor of like Boston or something. That's insane. I don't want to actually have to run things, but mayor of a small town, that's kind of cool. I think
if you buy a big enough piece of property, you could be the mayor of your own town. How's that?
Well, I'm buying 5 acres coming up here fairly soon, so I'll be the mayor of my 5 acres. And I'll be outside the county, so no one can tell me what to do anyway. Yeah. One of our colleagues, actually, we were talking with him the other day on another project that Tom and I are involved in. He has a large tract of land that is called a compound.
Yeah.
Hashtag not a cult. Anyway, back to the book. So Janie's life with Joe Starks. Janie's life with Joe Starks turned on the one hand was sold to her, right? Because Joe Starks was a good salesman, was sold to her as being one thing, but ultimately and fundamentally, Joe and Janie wound up hating each other, and that's explored in the book. And she talks about how the spirit of the marriage left the bedroom, and it moved into different parts of the house, and eventually moved out of the house altogether. I think that's a very stunning way of explaining how love can die in a marriage, or the beginnings of love can die in a marriage, and based off of what two people are doing to each other or not doing for each other in that situation. Janie's marriage ended with Joe's death in the book, and her moving from being a young married woman to an old widow. And I put old in quotation marks because I am 5 years older than Janie is in the book, and I don't feel old when she is widowed, in her 40s. This is a period of time, and Zora Neale Hurston explores this in the back half of Their Eyes Were Watching God, in chapters 9 through 13, where she looks at and where she begins to understand after Joe's funeral that she has a certain measure of freedom that she never had before, not even with her grandmother when she was 16, not in her first marriage when she didn't really understand love, and definitely not in her second marriage, gradually over time, with Joe Starks. She one of the lines that Zora Neale Hurston has, and I've underlined it in Their Eyes Are Watching God, I'll quote from it just very briefly. When Janie emerged into her morning white, she had hosts of admirers in and out of town, everything open and frank. Men of property, too, among the crowd, but nobody seemed to get any further than the store. She was always too busy to take them to the house to entertain. They were all so respectful and stiff with her that she might have been the Empress of Japan. They felt that it was not fitting to mention desire to the widow of Joseph Starks. You spoke of honor and respect. And all that they said and did was refracted by her inattention and shot off towards the rim bones of nothing. Close quote. At this part of the book, this part of the story, Janie is in a weird spot because she's single for the first time in a very, very long time. She's not looking to overthrow social conventions, but she's also not looking to go along. But just being what she is, being in that morning space is a space of throwing off social conventions in and of itself. Yeah.
I get the feeling that she didn't feel compelled to worry about social conventions just out of the simple fact that, like, she wasn't, because all of a sudden she's not poor. All of a sudden she's not for wanting. Like, she's very comfortable in her situation, so she really doesn't care what anybody else thinks at this point.
Right, but she can't say she doesn't care.
Rightfully so.
But she can't say that, right, to the culture. She can't be like, I don't really care. She's not in a space that we are in our culture right now, which is why I guess it resonated with me, this part of these chapters. She's not the space that we're at in our culture, which I described a few years ago as the I do what I want kind of culture.
Yeah.
Which to me strikes me very much as like a 4 to 7 year old's approach to life. Whereas Hurston's writing about or portraying Janie in a way that is counter to the convention of 1930s African-American culture, which is, and by the way, not even just African-American culture, just 1930s culture, period. In general, right? Where there are certain proprieties you will uphold. You will wear black in mourning, not white. And by the way, wearing white, just like that, threw everybody off in Eatonville. But you will wear black. You will show appropriate deference to the death of your husband. And then, of course, the thing that will happen at the back end of that is because you're a woman of property and means, you will, of course, get married because a woman of property and means can't possibly manage that herself. And by the way, you'll marry someone that's socially acceptable to all of us in the community because we have a vote.
Which is why she was getting courted by all the quote unquote right people, right?
That's right. Exactly. And so
I kind of like the way that the author, I just lost her name. I apologize.
Zora Neale Hurston.
Zora, yes, Hurston. I like the way she just kind of was like, I'm just going to write this how I want.
Yeah, I'll do what I want.
Well, she basically did the same thing writing it as her character did in the book. She just said, I'm just going to do it the way I want. I'm going to pretend I'm in New York City. I'm doing it my way.
This goes along with who she was. I mean, one of the things that Hurston said, and this is one of the things that you note sort of about her life, and it ties in at a deep level into Their Eyes Are Watching God, particularly later on when she's finally in her third marriage to Tea Cake, and we'll talk about that today. But there's a moment where a hurricane comes through West Florida, and we'll talk about this a little bit more, but there are Indians, or Seminole Indians, that are escaping the hurricane. And she has interesting thoughts about the Indians, which I want to get into, that Hurston puts into Janie's brain, basically. But one time, and I'm tying these two ideas together. One time, I think Hurston was interviewed, and she said that I couldn't find the quote on Google. Someone will go out and find it for me. But she said something to the effect of, "I've been the only African American in the room that didn't have a teepee or feathers in my background or something like that, or didn't claim it, because every African American claims that there's some Indian in their background. Every single one. I've never been in a room where there hasn't been one. It's weird, right?" And she was very proud of that fact. She was very proud of the fact that I can trace all my ancestry back to here. And she was an anthropologist anyway. I can trace all my ancestry back to here, and I'm not trying to claim, and I get a sense this is what she meant. I'm not trying to claim extra oppression here to win some weird game. I'm violating social conventions by not doing that, because everyone in the Harlem Renaissance was running around claiming that they were really this or they were really that. She's like, no, come on, like, let's be real here, people. And so you get that with Janie. You get that flying in the face of social conventions in this part of the book, which I love.
Yeah, same.
I love that. In our time, of course, we're consumed more with race than we are with class. And we've kind of talked about it a little bit on the podcast. We talked about it a little bit in To Kill a Mockingbird, the episode that comes in between this one, by Harper Lee. And of course, we'll talk about it again. There's no want to talk about, there's a loss of things to talk about with that. But I think the fact that we are consumed more with race than with class is a triumph of the approach to culture by those in the political activist camp of African Americans, the W.E.B. Du Bois camp. And I don't know what to make of that. I think it's very interesting that in a class-based life, evolution occurs more subtly. People adapt more subtly. And you and I were kind of talking a little bit about this earlier. When you have the ability to take your life savings and put it into a business, take a business venture, that's a class-based act. There's something there that, quite frankly, I mean, you mentioned earlier on this podcast, in the previous episode, but also in subsequent podcasts you've talked about this. And with To Kill a Mockingbird, you talked about this, Tom, how you grew up poor, right? Mm-hmm. I grew up working class. Like, my parents were working class poor, right? I don't think my mother made any more than $32,000 until the time she was like 50. That's insane, right? Yeah. And raised 4 kids and everything else, right?
I don't know, about 40 years ago, $32,000 a year was actually not terrible. Like, that was like, not
terrible.
I mean, no, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that you were upper middle class. I'm just saying, like, it was survivable is really what I should say.
What else? And let me frame this way. My kids know what arugula is.
Yeah.
Like, I get that arugula on, it's from Roll and Fry. I get that arugula on layaway.
So to your point, I mean, I grew up very poor. I didn't know what quinoa was until I was an adult. My kids knew what quinoa was by the time they were 5, right? Like, this. So yeah, I get it. So they're growing up better than we did.
Oh my gosh! Please, a feast of riches. I tell this to them all the time. When my boy, or not even my boy, I pick on him a lot on this. I do. I write him a lot. My middle daughter, my youngest, actually, no, not middle daughter, youngest daughter, when she's laying on the couch, just, should I watch like Avengers for the 4th time? It's another $8.99 on Amazon. Dear God. Yeah. How many times you got to watch Infinity War? You already got the plot.
Yeah, when my kids, so to your point, my kids are going, should I watch cable or Prime, or should I find something on Netflix or Hulu? Like, no, I'll check Disney Plus. And I'm thinking to myself, I had like 4 channels and they were all just disgustingly staticky.
Remember the UHF channels?
We didn't have a color TV in my house until I was an adult.
I knew it was out of control when at one point in time, and this doesn't exist anymore, but at one point in time in our house, we had like 4 remote controls.
Oh yeah.
I knew it was out of control. I was like, this is nuts. This is out of control. We got to stop this. Like, somebody's got to put the brakes on this. But yeah, like, Your kids know what quinoa is. My kids know what arugula is. I mean, they're living better lives than we lived. And to our credit, I think that that's because we worked hard at it. I don't believe in luck.
For sure.
But I also think that there's certain evolutions that occur as you move up or down the class structure. I think Hurston was sensitive to that. I think any creative is sensitive to that. And I think leaders should be sensitive to that. So I guess I'd like to sort of officially open up the question here. Just like leading people and with any other differences, right? Leaders have to be aware of class structure, but we have a real struggle wrapping our mouth around those ideas, in America, because I was telling this to somebody who I was talking to a few days ago, who's a Dutch person from England, and I had to explain to him that everybody in America thinks they're middle class, from Bill Gates to the homeless guy in San Francisco who's mainlining heroin with a touch of fentanyl. I mean, he thinks he's middle class too. He thinks he's just one more syringe away from hitting that middle class dream. And so talk a little bit about that dichotomy, because I came to that conclusion years ago that this is how people think, but I don't know if maybe I'm an outlier on that. So let's start with that. Like, how do we think about class in America?
Well, I mean, I think it's funny. When I grew up, I always had to hear about, there was the low, like you had low class, then you had lower middle class, then upper middle class, and then upper class, and then you had rich people, right?
Yes.
And then when you're talking about lower class, there was even like these subsets of lower class, right? There was like, you're just basically living in poverty, like that, or you're not even living at all. You're a homeless guy in San Francisco. I mean, you've got nothing except the shopping carriage you're pushing down the street. That was even different than being poor, because being poor just meant you didn't have extra money, right? Like right. You could survive on your basic needs, and then that was it. That was like you were literally living day by day on whether or not you could or couldn't afford food, but you still had a roof over your head and whatever, right? So I think that we've tried so hard to eliminate most of those variances or subset of classes, that like we just want there to be an upper, middle, and lower class, and that's it. Like that, right. We just want it to be those three things. And in trying to do that, we've just blurred the lines even more. Like we've just basically said, you know what? The class you belong in is the class that you feel most comfortable in. How's that? Like if you make 40 grand a year and you think you're middle class, then go for it. Call yourself middle class, because nobody's going to argue. Right? Like that's kind of where we're at this point. It's essentially where you've declared yourself, and not really where your actual.
Well, except the problem is reality with that, right? Like if I'm making $40,000 a year, that means my take home is 40,000 gross. That means my take home is, if I'm lucky, 32.
I was thinking closer to 27 or 28, but sure, 32.
Sure, that's why I said if I'm lucky, 32, right? Yeah. Depending on, and by the way, 32 in Arkansas goes a hell of a lot further than 32 in Chicago.
Absolutely, yes.
Okay.
Which is probably where more of what that comes from is what we were talking about a few minutes ago.
Yes, exactly.
40,
so if I'm making 32 in Fayetteville, Arkansas, my class is, and by the way, Fayetteville is not a bad town. I don't have a problem with Fayetteville. It'd be listeners from Fayetteville. It's a great place to live. Very inexpensive. I would encourage people from Chicago not to move to Fayetteville, but like, just consider it. Anyway, get out of neighborhood.
Well, at least if you're making 40 grand a year in Chicago, you should consider
it. Exactly. Get yourself out of Chicago. My God, you're dying.
You're making 40 grand a year in Chicago. You're living on South Side, right? Like that's like South Side Chicago. That is not a very good neighborhood. Apparently.
Well, you might actually be in one of those tents that you were talking about earlier, because that's all you can afford. Yeah. But $32,000 in Fayetteville, Arkansas, $32,000 take home. That goes a lot further in Fayetteville.
Yeah,
I think the challenge, particularly of the last 20 years in our era, has been the envy machine that is the mobile phone. because I can look around and see it was easier maybe 30, 40 years ago. In our historical memory, it was easier because like when I was a kid, I didn't know that there were other people who lived the way that I did that were like across the world or across the country. I didn't know that. I just knew the people same thing with you. I just knew the people in my neighborhood. Like I'll be honest, like I didn't know you. Like like the concept of talking to somebody, like my father, who was a huge radio guy and would have loved the internet, would have loved podcasts, would have loved all this. Like if I had told him that I could have a chat with somebody in London, he'd be like, why? What do you care with somebody in London? Is that going to change your life somehow? Like, what do you? And he wouldn't have asked the why from like an economic end. It would have been the why from like, you're getting an English degree. Why? You speak English. What the hell's your problem?
Yeah.
So it comes from that same space. And so where class ties into that is when I can see someone, and I use this example because it's the most recent one, but when I could see one of my quote unquote friends in Fayetteville who went to Little Rock this weekend to go see a Taylor Swift concert. And I know Taylor Swift tickets cost $1,000. And he took 6 people to the Taylor Swift concert and they took a bunch of pictures. They took a bunch of videos and I see the highlights. I can go to Ticketmaster and see that those concert tickets are $1,000. And I'm making $32,000 a year in Fayetteville. Or I can see that, you know, Brad Pitt shot his new movie in Chicago when I can see all the shots in Chicago because they're all on Brad Pitt's Twitter feed, right? I can see all of this stuff now. And so the envy that maybe wouldn't have been there for that lifestyle, for that class, now comes downstream to me. And by the way, the biggest purveyors, I think, in our time of this crap actually aren't the cell phones. I think it's the cell phones plus the Kardashians. I'll put those two together. Yeah, what the hell? I'll blame Kim Kardashian and all that, and Courtney and all that entire crew of nonsense that's going on over there. Because I think those people made envy cool.
For sure.
Them and the Real Housewives of whoever the hell, wherever. Like, it's never the Real Housewives of Fayetteville, Arkansas. It's never that.
Right. Yeah.
Like, who cares? Like, you want to see the Real Housewives of like Dubai. Well, why do we want to see the Real Housewives of Dubai? We went from Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous to the Real Housewives and Kim Kardashian.
Can we just say, like, I missed that show. I really missed that show. I don't know why.
Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous.
Maybe it's just Robin Leach's voice. I don't know, but I actually do miss that show. And I think the Kardashians ruined it because they basically became that show. Like it took over and whatever. But anyway.
Well, okay. So here's
like, what was it? The MTV show about the MTV show that toured the rich people's houses. Like I forget the name of Cribs. Thank you.
I love that show.
Between that show and the Kardashians and Pimp My Ride, Robin Leach had no shot.
I wonder what Zora Neale Hurston would think of Pimp My Ride. I wonder what she would think of that. I wonder what she would say.
I don't know the woman myself, but just based on some of the stuff I've read about her, I think she'd have had a problem with this.
She might have had an issue. She might have had a challenge.
If this was one of her children, I think she would have just smacked him upside the head and said, "What are you doing? Fix the car.
Fix the car. Stop it." Okay. So what do leaders do with class envy then? Like, because we see a lot of it now. And it's driven by this, like you said, we've tried to flatten everybody into the middle class, but then we have that other tension on the other side, which is I can look at what everybody else has.
Yeah. And I think that this beholds leaders to even be more diligent about treating people based on their merits and not their optics, right? Or any optic, by the way. I don't care what it is. I don't care if it's race, color, creed, class, whatever it looks like from the outside, and basically being in saying to somebody that we are going to treat you based on your actions, your actions and reactions, and how you perform for the company. It's really that simple. And I think that leaders have to be that much more diligent because it's so easy, right? It's so easy to get distracted with this other stuff that we're talking about. And it's easy to get distracted. My opinion, this is strictly opinion, by the way. If as a leader, as a person who has run sales teams and so on and so forth, I refuse. I will not go on any of my sales reps' social media. I do not want to see what they're doing on social media. Now, if I happen to see on our company site that they shared one of our company posts, I might like it. Great. Put a thumbs up on there. But I'm not going down a rabbit hole looking at their social media, because that could potentially very heavily influence the way I think about them the next day. Right. And videos of them on some table in a bar drinking and whatever. And if I'm a recovering alcoholic, which I'm not, by the way, I'm just saying, if I'm a recovering alcoholic, I see that kind of behavior, I all of a sudden have this tripwire, and I don't like that person tomorrow morning.
Right.
I have been pretty diligent about not going down the rabbit holes of looking at social media of my employees. And
No,
I
I
think
think that's wisdom.
that could potentially be something that other people don't do and gets them in some trouble.
So I think that's wisdom. I mean, I train a lot of groups of employees and managers and supervisors, and I've done that work for quite some time, and through my consultancy, and particularly in the civil service, like it's they are encouraged to keep their social media on lockdown, which is hugely important. And I know that when I was in higher education as well, I was not, and this is in the early days of social media before everything sort of got to where it is now. But you could begin to see the clearing at the end of the path, on some of this. I was encouraged, and I took the posture with my employees who were 18, 19, 20 years old. I said, we're not going to be friends on Facebook, because that was the big thing at the time. We're not going to be friends on Facebook until after you're graduated and already done. Because if you're drinking in your room with peers, or you're drinking in a place where you need to be drinking at, and you're doing it irresponsibly, I never said that, but if you're doing it irresponsibly, I don't want to know.
Yeah, right.
I really don't want to know, because what I know about, I have to do something about. And if I don't know, I don't have to do anything about it.
I don't even follow my own kids on social media for the same reason that you just mentioned. I don't want to know. I don't know what they're doing like that.
Well, and for my kids, I solved that problem in a different kind of way. I just banned all cell phones. But I'm working on a deeper cut than even that. But my point is that those kinds of boundaries between leaders and followers have to be maintained. But what do you do when what do you do when followers are friends with each other on social media? And now, because this has been happening quite a bit over the last 5 to 7 years, where I follow you on social, I'm your coworker, and you post something I don't like.
Oh yeah, I can only imagine what some of the yeah. Anyway, go ahead. Sorry.
And that right. Oh, you know where I'm going with this. And now we're all policing each other in this weird pseudo virtual environment that, again, doesn't have anything to do with the material real world we're all living in. Instead, is a reflection, a highlight reel of reality. But because the human brain can't distinguish between what's real and fake without being told, you have to be told what's real or fake, right? People don't have good critical thinking skills to be able to tell themselves that, or to be able to make those delineations. And so, my coworker posts the month we're in, so I might as well just go for it. My coworker posts a rainbow flag, right, in their bio or whatever, or writes some post about something. And I didn't know that thing about my coworker. I never asked that thing about my coworker, but I'm friends with my coworker. And maybe I have a difference of thought. And so I write something that's opposite to that. And I respond to my coworker. By the way, these things happen. The leader is usually the last to know by the time this stuff explodes. How do leaders deal with this? This is a huge question. How do leaders deal with this when this stuff explodes? Because usually they're the last to know. They're not invited. They're not invited to the original posting.
I think one thing, let's take a step back for a second.
Sure.
And I think if you can find a way, shape, or form to get ahead of it with some really good written company policy to begin with, this may not end up becoming a problem in the first place, right? So what I mean by this is, for example, maybe it's a company policy of not I don't know, maybe I don't think we could do this, but I'm just saying, like, you're not allowed to follow fellow employees that are in the same group that you are. Like, again, so like somebody in
Oh
the
yeah.
finance department wants to be friends with sales and they follow each other, fine, because guess what? If they get mad at each other, they're probably not impacting each other's day, right? Like, you can stay away from each other. But somebody in the finance department following another finance department person may be a bad idea, right? Like, so let's avoid that. Now, again, I don't know if that's actually even legal, to be honest with you, to tell somebody they can or can't follow each other on social media. But let's just say that it's not legal and you can't do it that way. You can still put some sort of company policy in place that says that your and be very clear about it. Your personal things, whether it's your personal belief systems or your personal social media, your personal family life, whatever that is not allowed to implode the workplace. And by implode, you list them out. Like, if you see something, if a coworker is doing something on social media you don't like, that's okay for you not to like it, but it cannot impact your workday. And literally list out some really clear versions of this. Now, that being said, even in doing that, I don't know if you're going to avoid that problem. I still think there's a possibility you avoid that problem. So in that case, but at least the leader has something to defer to as a guiding principle as to how to handle the issue, right?
Sure.
So employee A and employee B come into my office. What's going on? Well, they posted something on social media and they posted something on social media and we didn't like it. Okay, let me refer to this policy right here. Do you remember signing off on this? So tell me what about this policy you can't live with, and kind of make it more of a matter of fact thing than a personal attack on either one of their belief systems, because you certainly don't want to go down that rabbit hole, because if you attack either one of their, or even if you allude to what looks like an attack on either one of their personal belief systems, you forget about employee problems. You're opening yourself up to lawsuits. So you can't do that. But again,
well, and this is the brave new world, because you're also into, like, again, remember I said the leader usually doesn't find out about this until after the problem is already like begun, right? And we're well down the road. I mean, I've read stories about employees doxing and harassing each other, gaslighting, and just all kinds of nonsense, right? And again, the manager, the supervisor, usually the last in line to even realize that this is going on, although increasingly, and a lot of this I think was broken during COVID, because remote workers are working so much on instant messaging systems like Slack or Chat or whatever your internal system is. And we saw this at Google, actually, with the employees who organized and Google. So here's what Google did. Instead of having everybody follow everybody on social media or on Google, because Google doesn't do social, they're a surveillance and data scraping company. Instead, what they everybody knows. Instead, what they did was they instituted sort of a Slack, an internal Slack, where they allowed people to kind of blow off steam and kind of unite in the internal Slack, thinking that that was going to be the thing that was going to eliminate conflicts, particularly around 2020 and DEI and social justice and all these other sort of hot button social issues that are going on in the culture. And of course, Google's in San Francisco. So of course, everybody's got an opinion about these hot button social issues, because they're not in Fayetteville, Arkansas, where people would just be like, go outside. I don't know. Like, leave it. What? Stop. Okay. So, and I'm not saying that when you get people that would get upset about DEI in Fayetteville, Arkansas, but the vast majority of folks there are going to be probably a little bit more down to earth than the folks who are in Mountain View. Okay. Now, that didn't work out for Google. That internal Slack channel didn't work out. As a matter of fact, it didn't work out so well that some Google employees decided they were going to protest the Palestinian, Hamas, Israeli, Gaza war in the offices of people who weren't even in their work group, leaders who weren't even their leaders. And so they went and they boycotted the offices, or not boycotted, but they went and they barricaded themselves in the office and basically disturbed the workday. And I'll give you the punchline. This happened probably about a month and a half, maybe 6 weeks ago, and all those employees were fired. I don't think Google had a policy for that. Google didn't have the in case the people decide to take the thing off the internal Slack and go and barricade themselves in the office of people who don't even supervise them policy. I don't think they had that written down. And I don't know how HR even covers that.
Yeah. 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 Good question.
Right. I don't know. But it was one of the more ridiculous things that I saw. And I suspect that, and again, this is related to class. If you work at Google, you're of a different class than someone who works in, I picked a lot on Arkansas today, so I'll move along. I'll move across the country. You probably are of a different, think of yourself in a different class structure or in a different class distinction than someone who works in Memphis, Tennessee.
For sure.
Good, bad, ugly, or indifferent. You probably think of even though you both may make the same amount of money, $150,000 in Memphis, Tennessee, and $150,000 in Mountain View is still $150,000.
All right, but in Mountain View, you're living in a shack, and in Tennessee, you're living in a mansion.
Correct, but living in that shack, you think that you're of a better class because I work at Google. Meanwhile, the person in Memphis, Tennessee, may work for a plumbing company that's been there for 150 years.
For sure.
So class is weird, and I think Hurston hit on it. By the way, one last point on this. So I follow a magazine, I guess, a newsletter called Pirate Wires. I'm going to give a shout out to those guys here. They probably won't hear this, but I'm going to give a shout out to those guys. You should subscribe if you're listening to Pirate Wires Daily. They are very, very good, and they track a lot of this sort of interesting things that occur around the intricacies of class in tech, along with many, many other things in tech. And it's one of those daily newsletters that I get. And Mike Solana is the editor-in-chief. And one of the 3 takes, I get the daily update. It's a 3-take daily update. They have 3 articles in one newsletter. And the one that I happened to see dated today, got it at 5 a.m., 10 hours ago, as of this recording, which is June 14th, Flag Day, 2024. Mike Solana wrote, yesterday, Scales, and Scale is an AI company, I think. Scales Alex Wang formally announced his company's new hiring policy. And we're talking about this. MEI, or Merit, Excellence, and Intelligence, explicitly banning race, gender, and identity-based hiring from the company. Quote, that means we hire only the best person for the job, the founder controversially explained. And, quote, hiring on merit will be a permanent policy at Scale. He further controversially added, partly a public gesture of this kind was inevitable following years of DEI backlash. Partly, it's probably close to the law at this point following the Supreme Court's ruling over Harvard's racist admissions practices. But mostly, it's just interesting how few people melted down over his decision. No massive media backlash, no staff exodus. The man said, quote, we are hiring smart people. I don't care if they look like, I don't care what they look like. And everyone said, okay. Then he got a bunch of love online. Stay losing, Robin DiAngelo, obsessed HR cat ladies. It's the revolution of the same. That's from Mike Solana. Those are not my words. Closed quote. Merit, excellence, and intelligence. MEI.
I mean, welcome to the 21st century. Like, shouldn't everybody be like, what the hell? Who can, we're going to applaud him for something that like everybody should be doing anyway? What the hell?
This is where we're at.
Or something?
He wants a button. He wants a like button. Well, but see, now you can look at his posting that was somewhere. I think it was on Twitter that he made this announcement, and you can like it, or you can look at it and not like it and feel envious.
Yeah, sure.
The envy machine of social media. Oh my gosh. All right.
I lost the ability to have envy when I realized that when I was a kid that everybody had more than me. So I would be envying the entire world if I like, it's a useless emotion. I'm not going to worry about envy anymore. Just skip it. I'm just going to skip envy and go straight to jealousy on the people that I know that I can shoot for.
There you go. Well, and this is one of the things I sometimes will talk on our solo episodes. I'll sometimes talk about this whenever we talk about sort of more theologically oriented books like Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis, or we'll talk about Reinhold Niebuhr, or even Dietrich Bonhoeffer, right? Anything by a theologian. I I'm fascinated by the fact that almost no one in our culture, our modern, postmodern culture, uses those old school words like envy and jealousy anymore, even though we know what those emotions are, right? And we seem to have lost that language. Greed, oh, we know that word for sure. Like greed, please. I mean, who is it that said in the 1980s, quote unquote, greed is good? I think there was the movie Wall Street,
Yeah.
Oliver Stone put those words in Michael Douglas's mouth. So greed, we absolutely know, and greed we could spot like dimes on the highway. But the
Because we
other ones,
interchange greed with capitalism.
right? But the other ones we don't. We don't interchange like vanity with the Kardashians.
Right.
Like we don't interchange envy with social media. We don't interchange lust with pornography. We don't. No, we don't do that. It's just empowered sex work. Okay. Please, let's be real, people. Come on. And so we have all these old school human nature things, which Hurston would appreciate because she came out of anthropology. And there's nothing more, there's no other field, I think, that clearly shows exactly man's inhumanity to man at a visceral level than anthropology. Probably psychology gets there too. But like human beings are driven by these base appetites, and then we just try to put masks and levels and layers on top of them. And those masks and layers and levels we call civilization. Like we just do. That's what we call civilization. Because if we strip all that away, I mean, we've seen this in war zones. You strip all that away, and now you're into something else.
To take all those emotions, wrap them up in a version where you can control, and we call that humanity.
Yeah. And things still leak out the sides. Like, forget it. You can't.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, this is why. Hello. So I'm going to do some shilling here, and hopefully this will be a pause in our riveting conversation for you. I have an offer for you. My most recent book is 12 Rules for Leaders, The Foundation of Intentional Leadership. It's available in paperback, hardcover, or as an ebook on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Kobo, and any other place you order books. Now, in this book, I address the 12 leadership areas that I have found leaders need to be the most intentional in to be the type of leader followers actually want to follow. From establishing a foundation of leading teams through managing conflict effectively, all the way through leading teams through change, knowing what to do and why to do it can help readers, like the ones listening to this show, become better leaders. Look, reading this book and living it is like getting coaching from me directly without having to pay my full coaching rate. Head on over to leadershiptoolbox.us. That's leadershiptoolbox.us, and scroll down the homepage and click on the Buy Now button to purchase in hardcover, paperback, and Kindle format on Amazon 12 Rules for Leaders, the foundation for intentional leadership. And that's it for me. Now back to the show. This is why it's interesting that they're called the 7 deadly sins and not the 7 kind of sort of maybe dangerous sins.
I mean, just take out all of the other vernacular and just say the 7 dangerous sins would even be like okay.
They're kind of maybe not great. Maybe you don't want to maybe do this. No, like pride. Again, the month we're in. If we're using that term, when we really mean dignity, we fundamentally misunderstood what's at the bottom of both of those words. And we're a literature and leadership podcast, and so words matter. The word pride, just like the word vanity or envy or lust or jealousy, there's a darker thing at the root of all of those words. But words like dignity and honor and duty and and faith, there's something that's not dark at the bottom and the root of those words. And we used to kind of understand that, I think, in our culture.
I also think, and I said it, I made this comment on the episode, the part 1 of this podcast episode with Thurston. Words have the power that we give them. So if you're going to take pride and turn it into a negative, That's because we've given it that kind of negative power. It's not a sin to be prideful of something that you have worked your tail off to accomplish. Like, you can being prideful of that is not a sin, but we give that word that negative power or the sinful power based on other things, not being prideful about something you've worked on. It's a different kind of, so we got to be careful of how we assign the words, basically, in the manner in which we're using them and deploying them for certain things. Like, that all matters, right? Like, to my point earlier in that the first episode of this podcast, the words have power that we give them. Like, right. We give them that power. The word pride does not have power all by itself standing there. The word dignity, the gluttony, or any of the other seven almost dangerous sins that we're giving them that power. It's us. We're giving them that power. It's not as like, we can take those same exact words and move them into a different
segment. So
it turns into something different.
So I would like to use this opportunity to give the makers of Ozempic some marketing advice. Call it a gluttony reducing medicine, and we will be fine. People will line up around the block for it. Like, I mean, yeah,
sure.
because what we're doing is we're actually using this drug to reduce our appetite so that we are not gluttonous fools. And I feel good about putting those two words together. I feel just fine about that. So, at the dinner table, or, quite frankly, anywhere else.
Yeah.
I understand that there's very few things. And this, Seth Godin said this years and years ago. He wrote it in a book, or might have written it in a blog post, or I might have heard him say it. Might have been in a blog post, or maybe a book. But human beings don't like, and you'll appreciate this, Tom, being in the marketing space. Human beings don't like things being marketed to them baldly. They don't like being told the full truth of a thing. That's why we have marketing. And of course, he referenced back to, as I always do, the graffiti on the walls of Pompeii advertising ladies of the night. Like, there's very few things that human beings want to have marketed to them as the truth of the thing. But 99.9% of everything else, people want to gloss on it. They don't want the word used. That's why Ozempic is a weight loss drug, not a gluttony reducing pill that will probably screw you up later. By the way, I'm waiting for Ozempic, just like Olestra. Anybody remember that? I'm waiting for the devil to come due on that.
Waiting for that class action suit to be filed.
Oh, I'm waiting. I don't think I'm going to have to wait really long. I think it's going to come right around the corner.
Yeah, you might be right.
Anyway, back to the book. Back to Their Eyes Are Watching God. By the way, a great title. You might want to research where she got that title from. It's an interesting little story.
It's funny that you say that, because I was gonna ask that, because I found the title. I didn't research where it came from, but I remember thinking to myself, I'd really like to know how she came up with it. Like, what is the impact to her? Because there seems to be a story there for her on the title, not for the story itself.
Yep.
So
it is one of the lines that that they actually say here. In the, I think is it close to the end? Maybe. Yeah. After Tea Cake dies, and sort of the circle gets closed, right? And she talks about, Janie talks about several different, or not talks about, reflects on her life and on the nature of her life. And so that's sort of where that idea gets closed in. The other thing is the end of the novel, which we're wandering towards the end of the novel. The end of the novel and the beginning of the novel link together quite tightly, which is just like the end of the beginning and the end of To Kill a Mockingbird link together quite tightly. And so, which is the sign of a writer who did not lose the thread of the narrative. She didn't lose the narrative. And I could appreciate that. So the back half, right, of Their Eyes Are Watching God. So Janie and TK get married. Well, actually, before that, Janie meets a woman not meets a woman, but well, yes, she meets a woman, and there's other people who are like sort of floating around her trying to get her married off and all this kind of stuff. And she's like, I'm a woman in my 40s. I'm really enjoying having this shop. I'm really enjoying having my freedom. I'm not really looking for a man. She doesn't really say that, but that's what she means. That's what she means. And she's hanging out, and all of a sudden this guy comes rambling down the road, and his name is, I love this name, Virgil Woods, aka Tea Cake. And he courts her not by chasing after her money, and not by chasing after her body, and not by chasing after any of the sort of material things that maybe in an environment like that you would anticipate that a man would come along and chase after a woman if she had them, right? He wasn't interested in her class. He wasn't interested, and this is something that women need to pay attention to. And I thought it was interesting how Zora hit on this in the book. Tea Cake was not interested in Janie's money. Janie thought that Tea Cake was interested in her money. As a matter of fact, there's an interesting little moment that they have when they move from Eatonville to the West Everglades, where Tea Cake is going to go make some money. And Janie brings basically her life savings pinned inside of her dress. And she wakes up and she finds out sees that it's gone. And it turns out that he goes and gambles it, and he loses some of the money, but he brings back, more money. And, she's freaking out, and she doesn't understand that he's a gambler because he didn't tell her this from the jump. He just sort of presented himself as being this jokester kind of guy. And she starts losing her mind about the money, and she starts losing her mind about him going on and on with another woman. And he comes back to her and he says, I don't need your money. I just used it as a stake to start me off, but I can make my own money and watch. And he goes and he does. And he's a hard worker. In addition to being a gambler, he's a guitar player and took any odd job he could possibly be offered to make any money. And these days, Tea Cake would be called a hustler, not a scammer, but just a hustler, right? Hustled into his work, did hard work. And he was an honest hustler, right? He was even an honest gambler, which is so strange for Hurston to structure Tea Cake's personality this way, because I'm sure the vast majority of African-American gamblers she ran across were guys who were on the make, guys who were, not to put too fine a point on it, but guys who were pimps, right? Who were money hustlers, who put on a good show but could lose it all on a Saturday night. I'm sure that's the milieu that she was writing against with Tea Cake's character. He also possesses a deep devotion to being married to Janie in chapters 13 through 20, a devotion that runs so deep that when a hurricane comes through, they try to move to higher ground, right? And they get the warning that the hurricane is coming, but they don't take it seriously. And they don't take it seriously because they're quite frankly living the high life, right? They're making friends with Bahamian workers. They are figuring out how their culture goes. But as the hurricane begins to draw closer, they notice that the animals are starting to migrate, right? And the workers are starting to really realize, the workers who are familiar with how hurricanes come through the Everglades are starting to pack up and leave. And there's a moment that happens in chapter 18 where Janie is at home, and Tea Cake is off in the field working, trying to get his last few dollars that he can get before the hurricane comes. And this happens, which I thought of Tom when I read this, actually, in chapter 18, and I quote, "So she was home by herself one afternoon when she saw a band of Seminoles passing by, the men walking in front and the laden, stolid women following them like burros. She had seen Indians several times in the glades in twos and threes, but this was a large party. They were headed towards the Palm Beach Road and kept moving steadily. About an hour later, another party appeared and went the same way. Then another just before sundown. This time she asked where they were all going, and at last one of the men answered her. Going to high ground, saw grass bloom, hurricane coming." Everybody was talking about it that night, but nobody was worried. The fire dance kept up till nearly dawn. The next day, more Indians moved east, unhurried but steady. Still a blue sky and fair weather. Beans running fine and prices good. So the Indians must be wrong. You couldn't have a hurricane when you're making $7 and $8 a day picking beans. Indians are dumb anyhow. Always were. Close quote. I did. I sat there and I underlined it and I thought, okay, Zora. All right.
Yeah.
But this is the overlap. I mean, we ran into this when we read Black Indian slave narratives, right? Like this is the overlap between cultures in America. And it's so subtle what she's doing there. You know, Janie's perception, and then the Indians as the warning and not taking the warning seriously. Like, why wouldn't you? Right. But then the Bahamians, who were the folks from the Bahamas who were there, they didn't take it seriously either. They were staying out in the field making $7-8 a day. And as that sort of unwound, Hurston did a really good job in these back chapters of the book, dripping out that drama that was happening. And so the hurricane did come and it did sweep away everything that wasn't on high ground. And the Indians weren't dumb. They did know things. You should have listened. You should have paid attention. But it swept away everything and fundamentally wound up. Tea Cake and Janie tried to escape, successfully escaped for a little bit, and then wound up in a spot where, Janie almost drowned. And in the process of saving her, Tea Cake got bitten by a rabid dog. In the face, no less. Now, that bite doesn't kill him immediately. He shakes off the dog, fights the dog, whatever. But it winds up being a problem much later, as rabies moves through his body. And eventually, Janie has to do the thing that you do with a rabid dog, but she has to do it to Tea Cake. By the way, after the hurricane, the physical hurricane anyway, is over. Their Eyes Are Watching God ends with Janie becoming a whole person, weirdly enough, and winding up back where she started, at her home where her grandma was. And she becomes a whole person who can live by the truth of herself rather than seeing herself through other people. And the challenge, I think, that Zora Neale Hurston puts forth in Their Eyes Were Watching God is this one. How do you find meaning in relationships with other people? And how do you, in spite of class, in spite of cultural differences, in spite of race, in spite of how much money you have or don't have, where's the actual meaning in a life, right? Where's the actual meaning in a life from like 16 to 45 or 16 to 50? And the only place I think where you find that meaning is in marriage. And I think Zora Neale Hurston was a big fan of marriage. I think she thought that that was the social construct that was going to hold together not only African-American culture, but all cultures in general. And we live in a weird spot where marriage and familial behaviors and behaviors that lead to marriage have been unraveling for about the last 100 years. And that unraveling has created a sense of deep chaos between men and women. I mean, we're seeing it right now in Gen Z, the youngest generation that's in America right now. The rates of virginity are going up. Like, it's not just not dating, people not having sex. Now, pornography use isn't going down. That continues to trend up. As a matter of fact, studies show that in general, this is why I banned phones from my house. In general, a young man has his first touch with pornography these days at the age of 7, which is insane. And for young women, it's at the age of 10. There's something broken in that. And I suspect what it is. Actually, I know what it is. I have a good idea of what it is. But you can't give that to a 7-year-old or a 10-year-old via the dopamine inducing machine known as social media, known as the cell phone. without creating downstream chaos in an institution that's designed to find meaning. And meaning is hard to come by in a social and moral environment where we don't want to sacrifice ourselves in favor of responsibilities to somebody else. And even childbearing itself is on the decline. I mean, the United States is now below replacement rate. And what's weird is globally, most countries are below replacement rate. And this does not bode well. I mean, Elon Musk talks about how to save civilization, you have to have babies. Everybody laughs at him. He's right. He's exactly correct. Now, I had 5 kids. I had 4 kids myself. Tom had 5. I think Tom's had 2 marriages under his belt. You know, I was a divorce and family mediator for many years. I saw people's marriages fall apart. And so by hook or by crook, I'm staying married to this woman, even if I got to move into another part of the house. Like, it's going to happen. But I also think that this is an individual thing, right? So the meaning crisis is at the 50,000 foot level. Marriage and family is probably a little bit above that, or maybe it's right in there. But I think all these things link together. And Hurston with Janie was trying to show, I think, that marriage and family and even children, even though Janie didn't have any, can drive where you want to go and can give you a solid life. I don't know that love solves everything. I don't necessarily believe that. I'm too old for that. But I do believe that relationships can be the beginning of how you can have your eyes watching God just in your own life.
I think she makes that relatively evident by the fact that, think of the time frame that this book was written. The idea of a woman being married 3 times was almost non-existent. But right. She couldn't envision a world with this strong of a woman not being married. So right. I think to your point, and the only relevance I'm making there is, I think you're right that she valued the institution of marriage very highly. And yep. I think she had tied that to not just her own moral compass, but what she felt should have been society's moral compass, right? Like, she felt, right, because if not, then she wouldn't have written it in 3 times. Like, there was plenty of opportunity, especially when the second husband dies and she's got that wealth, status, money. She's got all that stuff that she needs. She's got everything she needs to live the rest of her life in a positive fashion, but yet still finds a way to get married, marries her off in the book to another person. So I do think you're right. I think she does value that institute very highly.
Well, and there's something else, and I think it's a subtle point that most people miss in any kind of analysis of any form of entertainment, whether it's literature or film or television. As forms of entertainment, creators put forth ideas into these vehicles that can move culture. We talked a little bit about this with To Kill a Mockingbird, right? Sometimes you're too early, sometimes you're too late, and sometimes you're right on time. And that individual creator imbues that product with their own moral view. Okay, cool. Atticus Finch, right? Perfect example in To Kill a Mockingbird. Atticus Finch, raising 2 kids with Calpurnia, who's the stand-in for the mother because the mother died. And Atticus stands as that, whether we like it or not, I mean, he's the paternal moral compass of that book, right? Whereas in Their Eyes Are Watching God, Janie is the maternal moral compass in this book. And Hurston herself never had kids. And I believe, if I remember her biography correctly, I might be confusing her with Catherine Ann Porter. I have to go back and look at that, but I don't think she was married, or if she was married, it was only once and it didn't work out. But be that as it may, a good creator, and this is a subtle distinction in our culture, and I think we're missing it. A good creator or creative looks at the structures of culture and says, even though those didn't work for me in my individualistic situation, they are still good for the vast majority of people.
Yeah.
And I think as our culture has become more and more individualistic, and by the way, individualistic meaning because it's good for me, it must be good for society. And so if it's good for me, it has to scale up to society. but what's good for society doesn't have to scale down to me. Screw those guys. They don't know what they're thinking. It's the whole Rousseauian idea that the state is messed up and I'm fine. And if the state would just change, then I'd be good. Except the problem is you're screwed up. like we're all individual. I'm screwed up. Tom's screwed up. All of our listeners, we're all screwed up in our own individual ways, as Charles Dickens would say, or Neil Tolstoy, actually. Every family is, uniquely dysfunctional in its own uniquely dysfunctional way, right? Like we're all dysfunctional. We're all screwed up. But that doesn't mean that I can take my screwed upness to society and be like, it's your fault, fix it. Or the choices that I've made in my individual life, it would be arrogant to the point of unbelievable to ask the laws to match my life. And yet we do this all the time in our postmodern society, our postmodern culture. And I think Hurston, I think she saw that coming in the 1930s and the 1940s. And I think she rejected all of that in a way that like a Richard Wright didn't, or the way that a Ralph Ellison didn't. And I think that fundamentally was the thing that caused Wright to have a problem with her, and Ellison to like just totally, completely kind of blow her off, kind of be like, oh, that's interesting, but I'm going in a different direction. Like her, and particularly her and Richard Wright, they butted heads because they were like their fundamental worldviews were just different. How can leaders stay on the path with leadership lessons from their eyes or watching God? What should leaders take from this book, Tom?
Well, I don't. We've talked about an awful lot with this.
We have book. Talked a lot about all the lot.
It's taken up 2 episodes of the podcast. So I'm hopefully the problem for me is I don't think I have like this epiphany about leaders with this book, other than the fact that like some of the things that we've already talked about, like being able to judge people based on their merits, being able to keep keep the insanity at bay by kind of the whole lead by example situation, mm-hmm. where she's writing this stuff because she feels like we were just talking just 2 seconds ago. She feels that the institution of marriage is important, so she writes about it. She leads by example there. Like she's trying to give everybody some insights into her own worldview. And I think that leaders can do the same thing by being true to themselves and being able to. I think there's a really hard thing to disassociate yourself from the chaos, but still be a guiding light to get people through it. I think there's a very difficult version of people that we're all capable of it, though. That's the thing I find the most interesting about us as a society in general. I think we're all capable of it. It's just whether or not you choose to do it. And I think for leaders today, they have to be able to base and judge people on their merit. And again, to your point a little while ago, including things like their class, their social status, their social media activity, their race, their color, all of that. And we kind of poked fun a little bit at that founder of Scales there, but the reality of it is that should be the norm. Like we should be able to do that. Like, why are we? Listen, I made a joke one day. It didn't go over too well. But one day I said, I'm not racist. I'm an equal opportunity hater.
Right.
And people were like, wait, what? Like, yeah, I don't care if the person's black, white, red, brown, whatever. If I don't like them, I don't like them. I don't care what color they are or what race they are or whatever. And it struck them as because they were expecting me to say something different, like that, that I'm not racist because I love everybody and all that. No. Right. I'm still allowed to not like people. I don't care that they're a different color than me or a different race. Like that doesn't matter. I should be able to base that on your merits as a person, not base it on your merits as whatever race, religion, color, creed, what sex, whatever. If I don't like you, I don't like you. And the leadership should still look at that and from both sides of that coin. You should like or dislike your employees based on their production, based on their importance to the company, their willingness to be a company person, drink the Kool-Aid, whatever phrase you want to use, but most of those things should apply to and warrant your thought process based on their merit, not anything else. I think Thurston as an author kind of got that. I think she understood that. And we talked about her own quotes in her own life in the last section of the episode. And I think just from her own statements and her anthropological research and all this other stuff, she already had that worldview in 1930. So, I mean, the fact that we're still talking about it in 2024, to me, is completely and utterly asinine that we still have people deciding whether they like or dislike somebody based on the color of their skin, or based on their social scale, or based on their economic or socioeconomical situation. It blows my mind. It just blows my mind that somebody from 1930 can already have this thought, and we haven't learned this lesson yet. So I think we can learn something from her dramatically, actually.
Yeah. I agree. And I think that the only way we're going to get there is at a one-to-one level.
Sure.
If you want to, books, movies, plays, operas, songs, these things have meaning, right? These things have weight. They influence and impact the culture. And one of the things we talked about this sort of where does a leader find their moral compass from? We talked about this with To Kill a Mockingbird. We just came off of D-Day, the 80th anniversary of D-Day, a truly amazing act of military prowess and just national will that we kind of don't understand fully. We are in June, so of course Father's Day is coming up. You'll probably hear this podcast episode after Father's Day, so for all of you out there who are fathers, including Tom, happy Father's Day. I know, worst there's a comedian, and I think I've mentioned this to you before, worst holiday ever. Worst holiday ever. And you can go find that joke somewhere. It's floating around TikTok somewhere or Instagram Reels. I don't know. That might have been where I saw it. But my point is, when we talk about where a moral compass comes from, and when we talk about how do leaders get something and stay on the leadership path while also treating everybody equally, right? We have to acknowledge that people have biases, and that's okay, by the way. And our biases, I think, are strongest, to your point, when they are against people who are just not behaving well. And I don't think it's hard for us to determine what bad behavior is, but it's become harder over time because we've allowed the removal of not just books, but also ideas from our culture. We just talked about the 7 deadly sins, in this episode, right? We've removed that language. And so we struggle to put words next to these things that we see, or even more weirdly enough, like vanity. We don't talk about vanity. Like I just mentioned, Ozempic should be like a gluttony reducing disease. Well, Botox should be a vanity helping tool. It's a vanity helping tool. You want to have thick lips and you don't want to go have a baby with somebody else who has thick lips genetically. Well, guess what? We're going to help you out because you're so vain, to paraphrase from Carly Simon.
Or Kate Hudson from
Kate Hudson
from Donald's Guide 10 Days.
That's right. We're not marketing it that baldly, but it is a vanity cure, or a comb over, or a baldness treatment, right? These are all solutions to the problem of vanity. I want to look good to other people, but I also want to look good to myself, right? And we wonder why there's a rise in narcissism in our culture. Well, it's not really an accident. So I think leaders have to pay attention to these kinds of things. I think Hurston gives us the way. To your point about her anthropological research, I think that that, as I said all the way at the beginning of our last episode, I think that undergirds everything that she did. She knew something deep about the human condition, and she tried to put that in her books and in her writing. So hats off to her, and read the rest of her resume. Get all of it underneath you.
The more I read about her, I got to be honest with you, the more she crept up my list of people in history that I would like to have lunch with. You always ask that question. If you could pick one person from history, who would it be? And my list is relatively long, by the way, but she was not even on it. And now, I think she's crept up quite a bit. I think if I had, let me rephrase it this way. I would definitely not say no to it if somebody said to me, she's the only person you can go back in history and have lunch with. Would you be willing to do it? I would do it in a second without even thinking about it. So.
She was great. Well, with that, I'd like to thank Tom for coming on for part 2 of the leadership lessons from the great books. Their eyes were watching God. And with that, well, we're out. Thank you for listening to the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast today. And now that you've made it this far, you should subscribe to the audio version of this show on all the major podcast players, including Apple iTunes, Spotify, YouTube Music, and everywhere else where podcasts are available. There's also a video version of our podcast on our YouTube channel. Like and subscribe to the video version of this podcast on the Leadership Toolbox channel on YouTube. Just search for Leadership Toolbox and hit the subscribe button there on YouTube. And while you're doing that, leave a 5-star review if you like what we're doing here on Apple, Spotify, and YouTube. Just go below the player and hit 5 stars. We need those reviews to grow, and it's the easiest way to help grow this show. And tell all your friends, of course, in leadership. By the way, if you don't like what we're doing here, well, you can always listen to another leadership show. There are several other good ones out there. At least that's what I've heard. All right. Well, that's it for me.